On the morning of June 4, 1944, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel climbed into a staff car at his headquarters in the Château de la Roche-Guyon and drove east, away from the beaches he'd spent 11 months fortifying. He had 3 reasons for the trip. He wanted to press Hitler in person for more panzer divisions under his own control. There was a planning conference waiting in Germany, and his wife Lucy's birthday was 2 days off. He could combine all 3 errands because the man reading the sky over the channel had just told him an invasion looked unlikely. German meteorologists believed the channel was about to turn rough, and that belief reinforced what Rommel already suspected. Behind him, at La Roche-Guyon, his staff kept working through the routine of a quiet defensive sector waiting out bad weather. Nobody scrambled, nobody canceled leave. The chateau emptied out a little more than usual that week, and almost nobody who left thought they were taking a risk. The man behind that judgment was Major Heinz Lettau, a meteorologist attached to Rommel's Army Group B. He had no reason to lie, and nothing wrong with his arithmetic. He was reading the same broad deteriorating trend that a Scottish meteorologist named James Stagg was watching 300 miles away in a requisitioned manor house outside Portsmouth. Both forecasts saw a storm system pushing toward Normandy in the first days of June. What they didn't share was the same raw material. The Allies had a far richer picture of the Atlantic, fed by stations and weather ships Germany had lost years earlier, and that data gap was only half of what separated the 2 forecasts. The other half was what each side's command structure would let a meteorologist conclude once the numbers were in front of him. 2 days later, on the morning of June 6th, while Rommel was still hundreds of miles from his command post, and his wife was still admiring a pair of gray suede shoes he brought her from Paris, the largest seaborne invasion in human history came ashore on 50 miles of that same coast. Around 156,000 Allied troops landed on WWII, counting the airborne forces dropped overnight behind a fleet of close to 7,000 vessels and more than 11,000 aircraft. German planning had treated conditions this marginal as conditions that ruled a landing out. The forecast wasn't the problem. The conclusion drawn from it was. That gap is the subject of this video. 2 services reading a similar storm and landing in different places on what a general would actually risk. It wasn't the only thing that decided the campaign for Normandy, but it mattered more than most people give it credit for. To see how a low-pressure system over the Atlantic turned into one of the more consequential pieces of intelligence of the war, start with the planning table, where the invasion's physical requirements got written down. Overlord couldn't happen on just any day. The planners needed a specific combination of moon and tide, a late rising, nearly full moon, so paratroopers and glider pilots could find their drop zones in the dark, and a low tide near dawn, timed so the first landing craft would hit sand close enough to the German beach obstacles to spot and avoid them, with enough daylight left afterward for naval gunners to correct their aim. Lay the calendar against the tide tables, and only a handful of days in any given month worked. In June 1944, that meant the 5th, 6th, and 7th. Missed the window, and the next one was nearly 2 weeks out, on June 19th, by which point secrecy and troop readiness would have been much harder to hold together, and tens of thousands of men, already briefed on the plan, would have had to sit in their embarkation camps wondering why nothing was happening. The man given the job of saying yes or no wasn't a general. He was Group Captain James Martin Stagg of the Royal Air Force, a meteorologist who'd spent the 1930s running weather stations in the Canadian Arctic and at Kew Gardens before the war put him in uniform. Eisenhower's staff gave him the artificial rank of Group Captain, so the senior commanders in the room, men used to outranking anyone who disagreed with them, would still have to listen. Stagg couldn't control the weather. He controlled the only information that told Eisenhower whether sending that fleet across the channel on a given morning was a calculated risk or a disaster. He wasn't working alone, and the shape of his team matters as much as anything said in a briefing room. SAEF ran 3 separate forecasting units at once. The British Meteorological Office's central forecasters, with the Norwegian-born Sverre Petterssen among the loudest voices, a Royal Navy Admiralty unit, and an American team from the U.S. Army Air Forces under the confident Irving Crick. The three groups didn't always agree, and they didn't pretend to. Petterssen leaned on a method of tracking upper air patterns that Crick's team viewed with some skepticism, and the arguments between them in the days before the invasion got tense enough that decades later, each side was still quietly arguing over who deserved the credit for the call that mattered most. Stagg sat at the head of the table, absorbed those disagreements, and handed Eisenhower one forecast that had already survived an argument before it reached him. That argument is easy to skip past in the retelling, but it's the actual mechanism. Nobody got to just announce a forecast and have it accepted. Every prediction had to clear a room full of people whose job was to find the holes in it. The first real test of that system came on the evening of June 3rd, with the original landing date barely a day and a half away. A young postal assistant named Maureen Sweeney was working the overnight shift at a remote weather station in Blacksod, on the western edge of County Mayo in Ireland, one of the first points in Europe to feel an Atlantic system before anyone else did. Her hourly readings, phoned in as part of neutral Ireland's routine weather reporting, were quietly forwarded onto the Allied effort in England. On the night of the 3rd, she logged a sharp drop in barometric pressure, the kind of reading that flags an approaching storm, and the report mattered enough that someone in England rang her back directly to confirm the number. It became one of the pieces of evidence that convinced Stagg the weather on June 5th, the original date, would be unsuitable. Eisenhower postponed the invasion by 24 hours. Ships already at sea had to be physically recalled in rough water, which was its own small feat of seamanship that doesn't get much attention next to everything that happened 2 days later. The next real test came on the evening of June 4th. Outside Southwick House, the wind was howling and rain was hammering the windows, and Stagg told the assembled commanders that he expected an improvement starting on the 6th. Not good weather, marginal weather, sitting right at the edge of what the invasion's own planners had specified as a minimum, winds easing into the range of 15 to 18 miles an hour, a cloud base around 2,000 feet, patches of overcast rather than a solid ceiling. Eisenhower didn't commit yet. He wanted one more look. At 3:30 in the morning on June 5th, after a short and apparently restless sleep, he walked back to Southwick House through weather that still hadn't let up, and at 4:15 he got Stagg's final briefing. The high-pressure ridge they'd been tracking was holding and building. Stagg's forecast hadn't moved from the night before. Eisenhower gave the order to go. On the other side of the channel, German forecasters had no equivalent argument to survive, and that had less to do with talent than with what the war had already cost their network. Through 1940 and 1941, German meteorologists had relied on stations across the North Atlantic, in Greenland, Iceland, and islands like Jan Mayen, feeding them a running picture of weather systems forming far out at sea before those systems ever reached Europe. By 1944, most of that network was gone, lost to Allied advances, and to a sea war that had quietly strangled Germany's reach into the Atlantic. Walter Stobe, a Luftwaffe meteorologist working out of Paris, had lost much of his Atlantic feed and was leaning on second-hand reports from pilots coming back from missions over open water. Stagg's team simply had more to work with before anyone in either headquarters had even started arguing about what the numbers meant. There was a second problem on the German side, and it had nothing to do with instruments. German planning had long treated winds at Beaufort Force 4 or above as a serious obstacle to any landing, an assumption shaped partly by Germany's own abandoned 1940 plan to invade Britain, when commanders decided the channel could never be calm enough for a crossing. It wasn't a formally written rule so much as a planning culture everyone had absorbed, and it shaped how a forecast got read all the way up the chain. Lettau forecast winds hovering right around Force 4, and inside that culture, a Force 4 number read as unlikely, not marginal but survivable. Decades later, in an interview, Lettau suggested he might have seen something close to the same brief improvement Stagg's team was watching, though historians disagree about what he actually believed in real time on June 4th and 5th. And his own comments came well after the fact, with the benefit of knowing how it all turned out. What's clearer is that Werner Schurtfeger, running the Luftwaffe's forecasting center at Potsdam, produced numbers in roughly the same range as Stagg's, winds around force 5, swinging between 4 and 6, close, but not identical, and German doctrine left far less room to read a marginal number as an opening. Major Hermann Müller, a Luftwaffe meteorologist at von Rundstedt's headquarters in Paris, spoke by phone with Stobe on the 4th, and the two agreed that while an airborne drop seemed possible, an actual seaborne landing in those conditions was unlikely enough to set aside. Rommel, briefed along the same lines, reportedly wondered why the Allies hadn't just used one of the calmer stretches of weather back in May, when several short windows of genuinely good conditions had passed, without any Allied movement at all. That difference in how each side handled a marginal number helps explain why a German field marshal felt fine leaving the most heavily fortified coastline in Europe 2 days before the largest amphibious invasion in history. It's also part of why a number of senior commanders in Normandy, not all of them but enough, were away from their posts in the days before the landing, some of them at a war game exercise inland that happened to be simulating an Allied landing. Coastal readiness eased in some sectors as the forecast hardened into a working assumption that nothing was coming, though not everywhere and not uniformly. The German military wasn't blind on the morning of June 6th. Radar worked. Patrols worked. Observers were still watching the coast. The surprise had less to do with anyone failing to spot the fleet once it moved, and more to do with a forecast-driven assumption, shared across multiple levels of command, that there'd be nothing to spot that week at all. That difference rippled through the first day of the invasion. The surprise the Allies achieved on June 6th, against an army that had spent years fortifying the coast against exactly this, came less from the Calais decoy operation, although that mattered plenty, and more from a German command culture that had talked itself into believing this particular morning didn't need the same attention as the others. By the time German units along the actual landing beaches realized what was happening offshore, the first wave was already committed, and the response that should have come from a fully alerted Army Group B instead had to be assembled by subordinates working without their own commander, who was still hours away by car. Stagg didn't treat the outcome as simple vindication. In his report afterward, he noted that delaying to the next suitable tide, on June 19th, would have put the fleet into the same storm system that, when it did arrive 2 weeks later than the invasion, tore apart the American Mulberry Harbor at Omaha so badly that it was abandoned rather than repaired. That storm lasted 3 days and stalled Allied resupply at a moment when the beachhead was still fragile. Historians stopped short of saying it would have sunk Overlord outright if it had caught an invasion fleet still at sea rather than a harbor already built. But most agree it would have made an opposed landing considerably worse than what actually happened on the 6th. Eisenhower knew what Stagg's team had handed him, and he said so for the rest of his life, crediting Allied weather forecasting as a genuine edge, even if the most quotable lines attributed to him are hard to pin to an exact moment or document. What's better documented is the structure behind the credit. 3 forecasting teams arguing it out until the most defensible answer survived, against a German side working with thinner data and a planning culture that left far less room for a marginal call to be read as a chance worth taking. After the war, the argument over who inside the Allied effort deserved the most credit never fully settled. Crick suggested his own team's methods had carried the decision. Oh. Stagg, in his own writing, pushed back and pointed instead to Pettersson's group. Petterssen himself mostly avoided the whole argument, preferring that credit go to everyone who'd actually sat in that room and made a case. James Stagg spent the rest of his career mostly out of the spotlight and died in 1975, having written one slim memoir about those 4 days. Maureen Sweeney went back to her ordinary life at the post office in Blacksod, married Ted Sweeney, the lighthouse keeper there, and didn't find out what her readings had done until 1956, more than a decade after the fact, when someone finally told her. She wasn't formally recognized by the U.S. House of Representatives until 2020, 76 years after a single phone call confirming her numbers helped move the most important amphibious invasion in history by a day. Heinz Lettau went on to a respected academic career at the University of Wisconsin, studying the same Atlantic systems he'd read correctly in 1944, before watching that reading get filtered through a culture that had already decided what it was allowed to conclude. If this is the kind of story you want more of, a like and a subscribe helps. There's usually another forecaster, another mechanic, another observer standing somewhere off to the side of the story everyone already thinks they know.